No such thing as indigenous slavers. It's where the book went wrong. In this book, that's where it went wrong in that particular instance. So we're going to try to avoid that. Yes, page 135. The greatest insurrection against the other slavery. In spring of 1680, the Pueblo indigenous peoples of New Mexico devised an audacious plan of liberation. The Pueblo world consisted. I gotta turn off the music. I forgot to turn off the music, everybody. There we go. Where was I at? The Pueblo world consisted of some 70 settled self-contained communities scattered throughout the upper reaches of the Rio Grande and its tributaries. Each Pueblo, the indigenous people secretly agreed, would rise up on the same day and kill its pharaohs and civil authorities, burn down its churches, destroy its Christian images and rosaries, and unmake all Christian baptism and marriages. On one decisive coup, these indigenous villages would erase most traces of the Spanish presence. The Pueblos had been then coexisted with the Europeans for 82 years, merely 3 generations, and the indigenous person named Juan Anzueti, who must have been more than 100 years of age at the time of the insurrection, still recalled, quote, as though it were yesterday when the Spaniards had entered this kingdom, end quote. He remembered life before the white intruders and believed, along with many other natives, that this earlier way of life would be revived. The rebels' greatest strategic insight was that nearly all the Pueblos should act simultaneously. If they could marshal their vast numerical superiority, they could dislodge the Spaniards swiftly. In 1680, there were 2,000 Spanish colonialists scattered throughout New Mexico, perhaps 3,000 if we include their indigenous and mestizo dependents. Unlike other provinces with booming silver mines, New Mexico remained a backwater unable to attract a significant Spanish presence. Those few settlers lived along 17,000 Pueblo indigenous peoples. Thousands more if we include the Apaches, the Utes, the Dene, the Manciso, and others. In some outlying Pueblos, such as the Hopi villages of what is now northeastern Arizona, the European presence was limited to a bare minimum. 2 Franciscan friars at Orabai, one of the Shung-O-Pavo, and one at Equatave. Killing these isolated friars and destroying their temples could be accomplished with ease. Other Pueblos along the Rio Grande had a sprinkling of Spanish families in addition to the local friar. Subduing these settlers would be only marginally more difficult. The greatest resistance could be expected in Rayo Abajo, around the southern Pueblos of Isleti, Almeida, and Sandia, where the Spanish population density was higher. And above all, the Spanish cities of Santa Fe, where 1,000 Europeans and their descendants resided. As the seat of government, Santa Fe also boasted the Casa Reales, a sturdy building capable of withstanding a siege. But even here, the Spaniards were outnumbered by the surrounding indigenous peoples of the Galisteo Basin. The plan was brilliant, but it hinged on getting the villages to act together while also maintaining secrecy. Taos, the cradle of the plot, laid at the northeast edge of the Pueblo world. It was 70 miles from Taos up to the city of Santa Fe almost 3 times the length of a marathon. Messengers on foot would require an entire day and a grueling effort to cover that distance. And Santa Fe was just the start. To communicate with the southern pueblo of Isleta, the couriers would have to run 140 miles, or equivalent to 5 marathons, to get to the mesa top pueblo of Acuma. They would have to journey 180 miles, or almost 7 marathons, to reach the Hopi pueblos. They would have to cover upwards to 300 miles, or 12 marathons. Distance mattered greatly when success depends on dozens of indigenous communities to rise up on the same day. If some pueblos could not be notified in time to act too early or too late, the insurrection could easily turn into a prolonged, debilitating war against the Spanish. Even more challenging than geography were the cultural differences. The Spaniards used the generic term pueblos to refer to all of these impact native communities. In fact, they spoke different languages and possessed different traditions and beliefs. Several of the pueblos spoke related languages of the Taino, the Tayana, linguistic family, but interspersed among them were villages that spoke Kirisan language, such as the Cochita, San Felipe, Zai, and the Acuma. Yet other pueblos spoke languages completely unrelated to either the Tayano or the Karasan families among the Zanu and the Hopi. As they plotted the insurrection, the leaders had to bridge ancient linguistic and cultural divisions. Ironically, Spanish already served as a lingua franca and probably facilitated the anti-Spanish conspiracy. Almost formidable obstacles was neither geographic nor cultural, but political. The plotters had to secure the participation of each pueblo individual, as there was no political unit larger than the notoriously autonomous village. The Pueblo indigenous people had wanted to shake off Spanish rule for 30 years, but every time they tried, they either failed to persuade a sufficient number of pueblos, or their plans had been revealed. In 1650, the Spaniards had learned about a plan to destroy the whole kingdom, which had led to 9 native leaders being hanged and too many others being sold as slaves for 10 years. A few years later, the ever relentless Pueblo of Taos had, quote, dispatched 2 deerskins with some pictures of them signifying conspiracy after their manner, end quote. But the plane had been abandoned due to the refusal of some Pueblos. In 1665, New Mexico's governor, Fernando de Villeneuve, had learned of yet another conspiracy and had some rebels, quote, hanged and burned in the Pueblo of Sinacu as traitors and sorcerers, end quote. The Project Revolt of 1680 was just the latest incarnation of a plan that had been long in the making and had failed on every previous attempt. Undaunted, Pueblo leaders gathered during the spring and summer inside underground ceremonial centers, or cave or kivas, where no whites were allowed. Several leaders were involved in the plot, but a 50-year-old indigenous named Popeye became the most visible head of the movement. He spoke, quote, with a voice that carried above all others. As one witness later recalled, many natives believed he was in contact with the Posemium, a cultural hero recognized by all Pueblos and whom the Spaniards believed to be the devil. Once the conspiracy got underway, Pope would stop at nothing to see the revolt through. He killed his own son-in-law to prevent word of the plot from leaking out. The murder occurred in Pope's house, quite likely at his own hands. His unshakable resolve carried the history. 5 years earlier, the government of New Mexico, General Juan Francisco Trevino, had launched a campaign against native, quote, sorcerers and idolaters, end quote, on charge that they had bewitched a pharaoh and some of his relatives at the pueblo of San Ildefonso. 47 shamans, including Pope, were rounded up and brought to Santa Fe. After an initial investigation, 3 prisoners were taken to the pueblos where they had allegedly used their supernatural power, Nambi, San Felipe, and Jimenez, and hanged. The fourth committed self-unaliving before his execution. Among the rest, the luckier ones received lashings or were sold into slavery. After the fierce flogging, Pope was released. He returned to his native pueblo in San Juan, where he stayed for some time. In the face of more threats, he retired to distant house, where he bide his time to plan his revenge. Pope and the other plotters set the date of the uprising for the full moon of August, after the corn had ripened. Since the leaders were medicine men, sorcerers, in the damning parlance of Spanish authorities, they used a network of medicine sorceries to negotiate and forge alliances. Each pueblo possessed a medicine association or society that structured the town's ceremonial life. Only society could take part of its gatherings and rites, although visiting medicine men from other pueblos were welcome. Through the spring and summer, that they knew little about the conspiracy, but that, quote, among the old men, many jantes had been held with the indigenous people of San Juan, Santa Clara, Nambi, Pajocu, Jimenez, and other nations. In fact, these, quote, old men were by and large the only ones who knew the details of the plan. Most of the others had only a inkling of the revolutionary change about to occur. Alaikum salam. Sometime in the late June or early August, the plotters made their final preparations. Pope dispatched runners to dozens of indigenous communities. Word travel on their feet. These runners kept keepers of accurate information and athletes of astonishing endurance ran in the summer heat, pushing as far south as Escalante and as far west as Acoma and the distant mesa of the Hopis, in pairs like snaked through canyons and skirted mountains, trying to remain inconspicuous as they covered hundreds of miles with ruthless inefficiency. They were sworn to absolute secrecy, and even though they would convene an oral message, they also carried an extraordinary device, a cord of yucca fiber, tied with as many knots as there were days before the insurrection. Each pueblo was to unite one knot to symbolize its acceptance, observed one medicine man from San Felipe, who was implicated in the plot, and also to be aware of how many knots were left. The countdown had begun. In early August, as the knotted cord traveled through the pueblo lands, the first sign of dissension appeared. Pope had failed to notify the Paros, the southernmost pueblos, of the plan, probably anticipating that they would not agree to participate. Worse, as the days of the uprising approached, some pueblos around Santa Fe refused to go through with the plot. They had initially supported the plan even though they had bear the brunt of the fight against the Spaniards residing in the capital city. But during the waxing moon, they began to reconsider the grave consequences and of an all-out war against the foe that possessed firearms and horses. With the moon nearly full and only 2 knots left in the cord, the native governors of Taos, South Marcos, and Sanija fatefully decided to switch sides. They journeyed to Santa Fe to denounce the conspiracy, and in a more personal and insidious betrayal, alerted the Spanish authorities of the whereabouts of 2 indigenous runners, Nicolas Catu and Pedro Amato, who were still making the rounds with the knot cord. It's kind of cold. Okay, here we go. Uncharacteristically, the Spanish governor and Captain General of New Mexico, Antonio del Aterman, sprang into action. Since he had arrived in New Mexico 2 years earlier, Governor Aterman had permitted a clique of influential locals to run the province in his name. He could not be bothered with the drudgery of government. Instead, he pursued his own economic interests with abandoned granting a free hand to his Maestre del Capo, chief of staff, a wily New Mexican named Francisco Xavier. On August 9th, however, upon receiving word of the Pueblo conspiracy, Aterman and his inner circle came alive. The governor first ordered a detachment to intercept the 2 runners. Catu and Amato were brought to him and confirmed that all the Pueblos would revolt. Aterman and his close advisors sent warnings to nearby towns, and the governor took steps to protect Santa Fe. He distributed firearms to the residents, posted soldiers in the main church to prevent its discretions, and made preparations in the Casa Reales to withstand a siege. After learning that their plan had been discovered, however, the indigenous leaders shrewdly moved up the date of the rebellion to the next day. August 10th, runners were probably sent out again to deliver a most urgent message, striking now. Extraordinary days. Next section. The revolt swept through the kingdom of New Mexico on August 10th and 11th, destroying houses, ranches, and churches, and killing some 400 men, women, and children, or about 20% of the New Mexico's Spanish population. The rebels did not engage in wanton destruction or discriminated killings. Pope and the other leaders gave them clear instructions. They were to destroy missions, churches, and all manner of Christian paraphernalia, to break up and burn the images of the Holy Christ, the Virgin Mary, and other saints, the crosses, and everything pertaining to Christianity, to wash away Christian baptism. They were urged to, quote, plunge into the river and wash themselves with amyl, which is a root native to the country, washing even their clothing, and to unmake their Christian marriages and the revolting indigenous people were to separate from the wives whom God had given them in marriage and take whom they desired. By many accounts, the rebels did as they were told. In the pueblo of Santo Domingo, a group of indigenous people descended on the church, killing the 3 missionaries and dumping their bodies in a nave. In the pueblo in Sandia, further south, the rebels destroyed a choir stall, infected on the main altar. Defecated on the main altar and snacked all the paintings and religious objects in the church, and the scarcity. They left the statue of Saint Francis, but chopped off his arms with an axe. They also flogged a large statue of Jesus Christ on the cross. The rebels also targeted priests and pharaohs. 21 out of 33 Franciscans, or about 2/3 of all the pharaohs living in New Mexico, were killed. Those living in outlying communities were the most vulnerable. In Jimenez, for example, a throng of indigenous surprised Fray Juan de Jesus in the middle of the night. They took him out of the cemetery, which had been lit with many candles, stripping him and forcing him to ride a pig while they beat and mocked him. Then Fray Juan himself was made to get down on all fours, and the assailants took turns riding and whipping him. After the pharaoh had been thoroughly humiliated and could no longer move, the indigenous people killed him by striking him with war clubs. I'm sorry, but they deserved. Sorry, but they deserved it. They deserved it. Similar fates awaited the missionaries living in the Hopi pueblos of present-day Arizona. At the Orobai, the attackers surrounded the ferry in the wee hours of the morning. They broke down the doors to find the room's only occupant and possibly the only Spaniard living in the Orobai at the time, huddled in the corner. The Hopis promptly slashed the farrier's throat, extracting his heart and dumping his body down the mesa. A nearby Shango Pavu, Fray Joseph del Tarzilo, did not give up without a fight. After exchanging angry words with many natives surrounding his house, he grabbed the sword and cut down the first indigenous person who broke in. The embattled pharaoh was then surrounded and disarmed. He spent his last moments dangling over a fire, his hands tied behind his back, until his body was burned completely. Fray Torlangio was a veteran missionary who had served in the Philippines and New Mexico, to the most exposed frontiers in the Spanish Empire, and had repeatedly expressed the desires to become a martyr in the summer of 1680, and he finally succeeded. Religion was clearly the flashpoint of the conflict. Throughout the 17th century, missionaries had made every effort to suppress idolatry and superstition, and to subdue the native medicine men, who had become their main competitors of antagonists. From their part, the medicine men had retained their traditional beliefs and clandestinely practiced their religion inside caves. When Pope descended victoriously from his perch in Taos and toured the Pueblos, he commanded the indigenous people to return to their old traditions and beliefs, declaring that Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary had died. Based. Yet earthly reasons also compelled the rebels to strike at the Spaniards, as the unfolding of the conflict makes abundantly clear. Even as the indigenous people attacked churches, missions, and remote ranches, Santa Fe remained unconquered. Slowly, rebels began amassing on the outskirts of the Spanish city. Within a week, some 500 warriors from the pueblos of Pecos, Galistio, San Cristobal, San Lazaro, San Marcos, and Canigi gathered less than 3 miles to the south of the central plaza. Armed with bows and arrows and stones, they began advancing, while burning cornfields and looting the outlying houses. The rebels made it known that, quote, they were coming to kill the governor and all the Spaniards, end quote. Since the start of the rebellion, the Spanish residents of Santa Fe had congregated in the Casa Relals of the Central Plaza. In the 17th century, the Plaza of Santa Fe, an unkept swampy area shaded by large trees, was roughly twice as large as it is today. Somewhere in this large quadrillion, archaeologists do not know exactly where stood the Spanish stronghold. It was not a spacious building, thus the atmosphere must have been infernal, as by improvising beds, latrines, and cooking areas, despite the continuous wailing of children and women, and the war whoops from the outside were audible. On the morning of August 5th, 5 days into the rebellion, the indigenous people, fully decked out in war robes, into the plaza and stopped in front of the casa rails. Indigenous people were barred from riding horses and bearing arms, yet this man, a protective leather jacket, carrying a harquebus, a sword, and a dagger, all Spanish weapons. As a further provocation, he wore a sash of red taffeta that had been looted from the church of Galisteo. Governor Otterman and some of his soldiers recognized the raider as a Pueblo chief who spoke Spanish and was known among the colonialists as Juan. The governor came out of the building for a parley. It was only then that Otterman finally heard what the rebels wanted. Juan requested that, quote, all classes of indigenous people held by the Spanish be given back. He also demanded that his wife and children be given up to him, and that, quote, all the Apache men and women whom the Spaniards had captured in war to be turned over to them, inasmuch as some Apaches who were among them were asking for them. Circus. Governor Otterman, who had been in New Mexico for 2.5 years, must have heard Juan's demand with trepidation. Like his predecessors, Otterman had been involved in the traffic of indigenous peoples. The anti-slavery crusade of the early 1670s had temporarily reduced the number of New Mexican indigenous people exported to the silver mines, but the slave trade had bounced back later in the decade of Otterman, had been a major reason of this resurgence. In 1678 and in 1679, the new governor had dispatched slave-bearing caravans from New Mexico to offer safe passages to other traffickers, quote, inviting everyone to go together in a convoy, end quote. As one witness put it, although it was attempting to portray Otterman as a grasping, covetous governor. In reality, he was no worse than other 16th century governors throughout the Spanish colonies, all of whom had to purchase their offices from the crown. Not only did they have to finance their position from up front, but they also had to be content with only half their yearly salary, as the crown kept the other half in the form of special tax called the media anita. To recoup their considerable investments, governors had little choice but to aggressively pursue all economic opportunities within their jurisdictions, including the trafficking of indigenous people. Otterman was still an outsider governor with little knowledge of the kingdom that he was supposed to rule. After the parley, he must have gone back inside the Casa Reales to discuss the rebels' demands with his closest collaborators, including his Maestre del Capu, Francisco Xavier, quote, to whom the governor had granted all of his authority and power, end quote. It was Xavier who may well have introduced Otterman to the slave trade and acted as his partner. Sources describe Xavier as a, quote, a man of bad faith, ferocious and sly, who had driven the indigenous people of Mexico to the ultimate aspirations. When the rebels had surrounded the Spanish stronghold, they had reportedly shouted, "Give up Francisco Xavier, for whom we have revolted, and we will return to peace as before." Xavier evinced a rare combination of religious intolerance and ruthless ambition. His zealotry was not new. Nearly 20 years earlier, he had started complaining about the Cachana dance performed by indigenous people of Azaleta, San Ildefonso, and other pueblos. Even though colonial authorities had authorized the dances, Xavier remained adamant that they were inspired by the devil. On that occasion, his misgivings had little effect. But 14 years later, after Xavier had ascended to Secretary of New Mexico, he was able to act on the strict religious sensibilities. He presided over the infamous 1675 campaign against indigenous sorcerers and idolaters, quote unquote, and the roundup of Pope and 46 other medicine men. He personally oversaw their trials and punishments. Unquestionably, Pope regarded Xavier as his personal enemy. As a long-standing notorious participant of the indigenous slave trade, Xavier had made other indigenous enemies, particularly among the Apaches. Xavier's signature appears on the 1666 receipt that acquired him to furnish, quote, 2 Christian boys of the Apache Nation, and one of them 10 years old, named Baltazar, and the other 8 or 9, and named Andres. To Governor Fernando del Villanova, 1665 to 1668, shortly before the outbreak of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, he had welcomed a group of Apaches who had arrived in the Pueblo of Pecos to trade. Pecos had long been a trading post linking the Plains indigenous people living to the northwest and Spanish New Mexico. The unexpected Apaches entered the Pueblo ready to do business, but in spite of the numerous assurances, Spanish soldiers promptly imprisoned them on Xavier's order. He distributed some of the Apaches in Pecos and sent most of them to Parral to be sold as slaves. It is likely that these were the Apache whom Chief Juan requested from Governor Ataman during their parley. Ataman Xavier and other members of the ruling elite faced a stark decision: comply with the rebels' demand or to release, quote, all classes of indigenous held by the Spanish, or resist. The first choice would have been the more sensible, as it would have relieved the Spaniards of the difficult conditions in their strongholds and allowed them to evacuate Santa Fe unencumbered by unwilling prisoners. Perhaps it would have paved the way for further peace negotiation. But the governor was not inclined to compromise. He questioned Chief Juan's motives, argued that it was not true that the Apaches were allied with the Pueblos. In this, the governor was misinformed, and that, quote, these parleys were attended slowly to obtain his wife and children and to gain time for the arrival of other rebellious nations to join them in the besiege, and end quote. To understand the unwillingness of Ataman Xavier and other many colonialists to part with their indigenous slaves, one has to examine who the people inside the Casa Reales were. We do not have a full list, but we have an excellent proxy. A few weeks after the siege of Santa Fe, Governor Ataman conducted and how many people may be dead at the hand of the enemy, end quote. In addition to the 1,000 people who took refuge in the Casa Reales, the mustered list included 500 survivors from Rio Abajo, who later joined the contingent from Santa Fe. In other words, the muster list accounts for every surviving Spaniard and his or her dependents, as well as their animals and weapons. It is an extremely rare and valuable snapshot of frontier society. In round numbers, the muster list includes a total of 1,500 persons. If we could have observed them standing in line, the first thing that would have caught our attention would have been the children. Perhaps 2/3 of those mustered were minors. We would also have been immediately struck by the groupings. Instead of an undifferentiated line, the survivors would have arranged themselves into extended families. 7 of these clans included dozens of servants/slaves and herds of 20, 30, or up to 80 horses. Tommy Domínguez del Mendoza, who, for instance, reported that the enemy had robbed his cattle, horses, houses, and crops and killed 38 Spanish persons, all being his daughters, grandchildren, son-in-law, sisters, nephews, nieces, and sisters-in-law, as a common knowledge. Then don't fuck with shit that's not yours. Sorry, they're resisting your fucking... Anyways, but this New Mexican patriarch still passed muster with 55 persons, including his wife, four married sons, with 8 children and their families, quote, male and female servants, young and old, and 30 horses. Governor Ataman's circumstances were similar. He traveled with an entourage of 30, quote, servants, Spaniards, black people, and indigenous people, and thus passed muster with 30 attendants and servants. All right, I'm going to take a little small break. Look back. Hardly anybody saying anything. It's okay. Standing next to these clans, we could have noticed some 20 families not quite as rich as the governor, but still well off. Mostly the families and ranchers and military officers, each of which possessed half a dozen to a dozen servants and some horses. The rest were poor New Mexicans, indigenous people from central Mexico, and convicts sent to New Mexico to serve out their sentences. Widows with large progenies. Let me make sure. I'm going to look up this word, everybody. Be right back. It was progenies, rank and file soldiers, and others. Yet even some of them had servants. Oh my gosh. Apollonera Martin passed mustered, on foot, naked, and without arms. The mustered secretary thought it appropriate to add that he was, quote, extremely poor. And yet Martin declared 3 servants. Similarly, Catalina de Zimmer was a widow who passed mustered with 4 grown nieces, all on foot and extremely poor, end quote. But she reported 5 servants and a convict named Cristobal del Vallecos listed his wife and small children and 2 female servants. By the time the Spanish colonialists had already lost 200 or 300 servants to the rebellion. Some of these servants had fled in the earlier days of the insurrection, while others had been carried off by the attackers or had died in battle. But the colonialists retained many more. In rough numbers, 1,000 Spaniards owned 500 servants, collectively worth a fortune of about 50,000 pesos. Indeed, it was the Spaniards' pervasive take in the human loot of New Mexico that had brought them to their bloody stand. Back in Santa Fe, Governor Ottoman was his close circle of advisors and many other colonialists, defying almost all logic, refused to surrender their captives and prepare for a long fight. But with the passing of each day, their situation became more desperate. Following the ineffective parley, and as the Pueblo warriors began advancing from the south towards the Spanish stronghold, Spaniards and indigenous people fought in alleyways, in adobe houses, and in the barrios too, the south of Santa Fe. Having barely stopped this advance, Spanish soldiers learned on August 17th that another contingent of indigenous peoples from Taos and Picures had entered Santa Fe from the north, setting up camps on a strategic elevation not far from the Casa Rallies. The indigenous attackers now numbered about 2,000. Quote, "They surrounded us from all parts," wrote the chronicler, "and set fire to the main church and to other houses, and took up positions in several buildings." The rebellious indigenous people also managed to cut off the water supply to the Casa Relas. The Spaniards' situation was becoming untenable. But they held out for a few more days, at least on August 21st, quote, "reduced to an extremity of dying inside or going out to fight," end quote. The Spaniards made their move. A stream of 1,000 people flowed out of the Casa Reales and straggled southward, fleeing for their lives. The adult males bearing arms numbered only about 100. They were posted at the front and the rear and along the flanks of the crowd of women and children, servants and animals. The armed men had to not only fend off indigenous attackers from the outside, but also guard against escape attempts from the inside. The first day, the refugees walked merely one length, or about 3 miles. They spent the night in a broad field just outside where they could easily spot any approaching warriors. The rebels were now in complete control of Santa Fe. Over the next few weeks of their journey, the Spaniards got their first look at the devastation in the wake of the insurrection. They passed through abandoned pueblos and past burning churches and ranches. They strewn corpses as they moved southwards, following the bank of the Rio Grande. The victorious rebels followed the retreating Spaniards, but left their way unimpeded. Within 2 months, the Spanish had abandoned the Kingdom of New Mexico and would not be back for 12 years. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 had succeeded. Revolution succeeding right there. Explaining the insurrection. You see what time it is. We're doing good. For more than 3 centuries, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 has fascinated churchmen, public officials, booksellers, scholars, and the public at large. This was, quote, "the secret rebellion that drove the Spaniards out of the Southwest," as they subtitled one of the books proudly proclaims. But what motivated the indigenous people to risk their lives in an uncertain insurrection in the first place? What compelled them to bloody their hands, torturing and killing? Ever since the 17th century, religion has been offered as a primary driver of the indigenous act. Indeed, Spaniards who lived through the rebellion pointed their fingers at the devil. We may scoff at such an explanation, but 17th century Christians fervently believed that the devil roamed in the world and mingled with humans. Satan preyed especially on the weak. In Europe, he tended to credulous women and turned them into witches. In fact, witchcraft trials peaked in Europe and North America in the 17th century. The famous Salem witch trials took place in 1692. And in the New World, the devil had a field day among the uncovered and recently converted indigenous people. Unconverted or recently converted indigenous people, particularly on remote frontiers. He tricked them into performing human sacrifices or adorning idols and rejecting Christianity. Throughout the 17th century, northern Mexico had rocked by rebellion reportedly inspired by the devil. In regard to the anti-Spanish movement that broke out of the Northwest Mexico in 1601, one Jesuit wrote, quote, "These old indigenous people were the principal instigators of the uprising because by means of a diabolical spell, they had their people believe the Christian Spaniards were against them. Jesus Christ," end quote. In the mid-century, a priest in Durango similarly declared that indigenous people, quote, "are subject to the influence of shamans, instruments of the devil, who incite their listeners to rebel and commit atrocities," end quote. In such a charged spiritual landscape, Pope's machination in New Mexico would only have been interpreted as the devil's last ploy to roll back the kingdom of Jesus Christ on earth. A much later generation of Anglo-Americans, writers of the Southwest, arrived at a different interpretation of the Pueblo Revolt. Historians and authors of the late 19th century reject the preternatural. I gotta look up this word, everybody. All right, back. Preternatural, what's beyond normal. Preternatural explanation advanced by their colonial predecessors. Yet they continue to place religion at the core of the insurrection. In their view, the fanaticism and the zealotry of Spanish church officials drove the indigenous people of New Mexico to the breaking point. The verdict of L. Bradford Prince, governor of the territory of New Mexico, from 1889 to 1893 was quite typical. Quote, "Religious feeling was a very strong element among the causes which led to the revolution." Prince wrote in 1883, quote, and a bitter hatred of the Christianity of the Spaniards was evinced in each and every act during the struggle. The most influential articulator of this view was San Francisco-based collector, extraordinary and entrepreneur Hubert Howe Bancroft. A far cry from the self-effacing historian, Bancroft was an imperious CEO of H&H Bancroft and Company, the largest book-selling concern in the western United States. This transplanted Easterners progressed rapidly from book dealers to collectors to author. His approach to history writing was much like much else he did industrial. What? He set up a literary workshop that employed more than 600 individuals. These assistants not only cataloged his vast collections of books and documents, but also took notes and assembled data on the known, quote, facts of the particular area and period, composing preliminary texts of their findings. Bancroft went over these drafts, revised them, sometimes minimally, and published them under his name. Bancroft Operation published 39 hefty volumes offering a grand historical panorama of Central America, Mexico, and American Southwest, and the Pacific coast of it as far as Alaska. One of his tomes dealt with New Mexico and naturally included the section of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Using the most formidable array of 17th century documents from New Mexico assembled up to that time, Bancroft surveyed half a century of New Mexico history prior to the uprising. He regretted that he could not offer a, quote, continuous and complete narrative, in mild reproach of his helpers, no doubt. Despite this gaps in his knowledge, Bancroft anchored his narrative firmly on Spanish Christianization efforts on the Pueblo resistance, as he summed up the process of Spanish furriers. Quote, worked zealously to stamp out very vestige of the process of Spanish furriers, working zealously, native rights, and the authorities had enforced the strictest accomplice with Christian regulations, not hesitating to punish the slightest neglect, unbelief, or relapse into paganism. As for the Pueblo, Bancroft ventures the opinion that they, quote, seem to have been more strongly attached than most American tribes to their aboriginal faith, and they had secretly continued, so far as possible, a practice of the old forms of worship. The stage was set to the conclusion inescapable. The clash of 1860 rested, quote, largely on religious grounds. Scholars of the past 30 years have revised Bancroft's interpretation. Their explanation of the Pueblo Revolt combined multiple cases, including short-term disruptions such as families and epidemics, and long-term or structural factors such as the religious antagonism. But while all leading explanations are now multi-casual, they continue to emphasize the religious character of the revolt. Historian Ramon Gutierrez has advanced what remains the most convincing formulation of the religious thesis. According to Gutierrez, in the earlier decades of New Mexico's colonization, the Pueblo indigenous people accepted Christianity peacefully, or at least did not actively oppose it. But starting in the 1640s, they grew disillusioned as their lives deteriorated markedly due to famine, illness, and intensified raids from Apaches and Pueblos. Came to believe that the God of the missionaries was unable to protect them. Gutierrez writes, quote, the Franciscans were no longer the supermen they had once seemed. The novelty of their gifts had worn off, and their magic had proven ineffectual in producing rain, health, prosperity, and peace. The Pueblo confidence was further undermined in the late 1660s when a 4-year famine following by the epidemic in 1671. The natives increasingly shunned Catholicism and turned to traditional shamans for guidance and relief. In turn, the missionaries of New Mexico grew alarmed as these developments. For 2 generations, they had worked hard to Christianize the Pueblos. They had built more than 40 churches and chase-led a community of believers out of the desert. Now, suddenly, the entire spiritual enterprise appeared to be in jeopardy. The missionaries felt betrayed and responded, quote, as any father would have with disobedient children. Ew, end quote. Gutierrez tells us, quote, punishment began. What makes this picture of the indigenous people a disillusionment leading to increased Spanish severity, oh my gosh, gotta look at this word, hold on. Severity, especially convincing it that plenty of evidence of religious inspired oppression and cruelty existed in the available documentation. Some duress, an occasional corporal punishment are to be expected on the remote frontier, where a handful of missionaries attempted to enforce religious orthodoxies on recalcitrant communities. The reality, however, was far worse. Nearly impunity permitted farriers to extract unpaid native labor. Governors Bernardo Lopez de Mendizabal, 1659 to 1661, flatly accused the missionaries of exploiting the indigenous people under the pretense that it was, quote, for the temples and divine worship, end quote, and forced, quote, all indigenous people of the pueblos, men as well as women, to serve them as slaves, end quote. Some of the farriers also abused their privileged position to procure sex. Oral traditions from the Hopi villages, which are collaborated at least in part by documentary information, detail how some farriers at Orabai and Shangonpovai would send the men to fetch water in distant places so that the farriers could be with the women during their absence. Most threatening of all was the missionaries' capacity to torture and kill in the name of God. The worst offenders was the aptly named name of Salvador de Guerrera, a farrier who terrorized the Hopi pueblos during the 1650s. Like other farriers working in near complete isolation, he lived with a concubine in spite of his vows of celibacy. He also forced the indigenous people to weave cotton, matas, setting minimum quotas that they had to meet to avoid punishment. And when it came to fighting the devil, Farrier Guerrera had few peers. Not only did he beat suspected idolaters and hencheriers, but he also soaked them in turpentine and set them on fire. In one instance, a witness reported a luckless native who survived the turpentine treatment, quote, got up and desiring to go by a certain road where there was a tank of water to throw himself into, took another road which leads to Santa Fe, and Fray Salvador de Guerrera mounted a horse thinking that the indigenous people was going to complain to the government, and followed him and rode over with him the horse until he killed him. There is no question that religious thesis of the Pueblo Revolt explains a great deal, but like all historical explanation, it hinges on highlighting certain episodes of personalities while de-emphasizing others. The religious character of the movement is so striking and seductive that it overshadows the material motivation of the uprising, which often appears as mere catalysts or triggers subordinated to the more fundamental religious cleavage. Especially in the past decade, the search on indigenous servitude has opened new vistas on the turning point of the Pueblo Revolt. New understanding of rising levels of exploitation and enslavement of New Mexico became integrated within the silver economy. of the Northwest Mexico. A story told earlier in this book indicates that it was this pressure rather than the burst of inquisitorial. I gotta look up this word. I know what it is. I just gotta look it up. So I can't say it. Inquisitorial activities. There we go. Inquisitorial activity that led to the growing turmoil in the years leading to, up to 1860. Surely factors other than, quote, the other slavery, end quote, were caused by, or causes, were causes of the rebellion. Long simmering religious animosities, famine, and illness made the mix even more volatile. But the rising level of exploitation, which can be documented in the archival records, belonging at the core of this story. In the course of the 17th century, the silver economy expanded, and it was New Mexico misfortune to function as a reserve or of coerced labor and a source of cheap products for the silver mines. It did not take the bad behavior of too many Spanish governors, friars, and colonialists compelling the indigenous people to carry salt, robbing their pelts, locking them up in textile sweatshops, and organizing raiding parties to procure Apache slaves, to bring about widespread animosity, resentment, and ultimately rebellion. The case of the Pueblo Revolt as a rebellion against the other slavery rests on three types of evidence. The first comprised testimonies of Pueblo rebels, the Spaniards who had few opportunities to learn about the causes of the rebellion during their hasty exodus from New Mexico. A year and a half would pass before they were able to gather additional intelligence. At the end of 1681, Governor Ataman led a group of Spanish soldiers and colonials back to New Mexico. During this foray, they were able to capture 9 Pueblo indigenous people who were brought before the governor for question. Their disposition were recorded over a 2-week period in late December 1681 and earlier January 1682. Understandably, Pueblo captives were vague when asked pointedly about the, quote, cause and reason that led all the indigenous people of this kingdom to rise up. Still, out of the 8 extant testimonies, 4 contain concrete references of Spanish exploitation. On an 8-year-old indigenous person from San Felipe named Pedro Narejo, for example, declared that in the wake of the insurrection, the indigenous people had remained, quote, free from the work requests by the farriers and the other Spaniards which they had no longer bear, and that this was a real reason of legitimate cause that they had to rise up, end quote. A 20-year-old Ladino Hispanicized indigenous person named Joseph similarly declared that, quote, the causes generally given were the ill treatment and abuses of the indigenous peoples received from the current Segregato, Francisco Xavier, and the Maestre del Campo, Alonso Garcia, and the Segregatos, Maras, Sergeant Majors, Luis del Jajantin, and Diego Lopez, because they had hit them and taken away what they had and made them work without paying them anything. 2 other prisoners, Brother Juan and and Francisco Lorenzo, also named Francisco Xavier, was a major reason for the rebellion. These few surviving testimonies made it to may be too slender a reed on which to hang a interpretation of overall rebellion, but they are very suggestive nonetheless. The timing of the insurrection also led credence to the theory that indigenous slavery was the cause of the rebellion. As already noted, the Pueblo Revolt was long in the making. On at least 3 different occasions between 1650 and 1680, the Pueblos had attempted to launch their unified movement against their Spanish overlords. Yet this period of Pueblo insurgency is puzzling because it was characterized by relative demographic stability. A few sources mention famines and epidemics, particularly towards the late 1660s. But this famine and pestilence episode does not jibe with the upheaval of 1680. At least to my knowledge, there is not a single testimony claiming that the Pueblos rebelled in 1680 to 1681 because of famine or pestilence. However, this 30-year period of Pueblo unrest corresponds admirably with the deepening of the commercial ties between New Mexico and the silver mines of northern Mexico. Since its founding in 1631, Parral had attracted resources and peoples to its flourishing mines. As we have seen, New Mexico officials and private citizens respond to these new economic opportunities by setting up the seizures of indigenous products, pressing natives into New Mexico, textile sweatshops, or raiding Apache ranchers to procure slaves. The indigenous slave trade blossomed during the 1650s and 1660s and 1670s, precisely when the Pueblo indigenous people were plotting against the Spaniards. The last body of evidence that suggests that the Pueblo Revolt was triggered by labor coercion has to do with the ethnic and geographic scopes of the insurrection. Though generally known as the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, the movement in fact spread far beyond New Mexico and came to involve not only Pueblos, but also the Apaches, the Mansoso, the Conchos, the Sumas, the Pimas, the Llanos, the Salerinos, the Taboso, and many other groups. Some scholars even refer to this multi-ethnic insurrection as a Great Northern Rebellion. But regardless of the label, the geography of the revolts of the 1680s and early 1690s is quite intriguing. Broadly speaking, the rebellion spread along 2 corridors, one running due south from New Mexico into El Paso, Llanos area, then on through central and southern Chihuahua to, quote, to the doors of El Parral and La Vezzacay, and the other extended west into what is today Arizona and Sonora, to the mines of San Juan Bautista, or Apadepi, or the Terracachia. What these regions and their indigenous inhabitants had in common was that they had all been subject to a gravitational pull of the silver economy. The geography of the rebellion maps exceedingly well into the slave corridors. It's leading to Parral, explaining the motives of the peoples in times that are remote from our own is a dicey business. And of course, rebellions are seldom triggered by a single cause. Still, it's remarkable how writers and historians have accorded indigenous slavery so modest a role in their explanations of the Pueblo Revolt. Without a doubt, however, the rebellion that raged through much of the 1680s and 1690s redefined labor relations in northern Mexico. Indigenous people in New Mexico, Chihuahua, Durango, Sonora, and Coahuila challenged slavery and forced important changes in the ways of traffic of humans was conducted in the following centuries. All right, we're going on to another chapter, maybe. Chapter 7. Chapter 7. I brought up my voice because there's it was because Ethan was loud with the phone. Powerful nomads. Native Americans were involved. I'm not saying this. No. At first, they offered captives to the newcomers and helped them develop new networks of enslavement, serving the guides and guards and intermediaries of local providers. But with the passage of time, as indigenous acquired European weapons and horses, they increased their power and came to control an even larger share of the... Yeah, that's bullshit. Their rise influence was evident throughout North America. In the Carolinas, for instance, English colonialists took tens of thousands of indigenous slaves and shipped many of them to the Caribbean. In the period between 1670 and 1720, the Carolinas exported more indigenous people out of Charleston, South Carolina, than they imported Africans into it. As this traffic developed, the colonialists increasingly procured their indigenous captives for the Westo indigenous peoples, and anthropologist Robbie Etheridge has coined the term militaristic slaving societies to refer to groups like the Westos that became major suppliers of native captives to the Europeans and other indigenous peoples. The French of Eastern Canada had similar experience. They procured thousands of indigenous slaves during the 17th and 18th century, but as they moved away from Quebec and Montreal into the Great Lake regions and upper Mississippi Basin, they encountered a world of bondage they could secretly comprehend, let alone control. Indigenous... This dude, no, this whole sentencing shit is bullshit. Hold on. Oh my God, no. Most dramatic instances of indigenous intervention occurred in what is now the American Southwest. Multiple factors propelled indigenous people of this region to become prominent. Oh no, dude. The royal anti-slavery activism of the Spanish crown and the legal prohibitions against indigenous slavery dissuaded some Spanish slavers of northern Mexico, leaving a void that others filled. Moreover, the indigenous rebellions of the 17th century that culminated the Great Northern Rebellion, restricting the flow of indigenous slaves from some regions, and led to the opening of new slaving grounds, creating new opportunities. Most important, the diffusion of horses and firearms accelerated at this time, giving some indigenous the means of... This whole chapter's bullshit. Thus, new traffickers, new victims, and new slave routes emerged in the 17th and 18th century. Some native communities experienced a process of deterritorialization, as Cecilia Sheridan has called it, becoming a more from other traditional homelands, fusing with other groups, and reinventing themselves as mobile bands capable of operating over vast distances. They made a living by trading the spoils of war, including horses and captives. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 succeeded in expelling the Spaniards from New Mexico. When the colonials returned in 1692, the world, as they had known it, had changed during their 12 years' absence. The return of Spaniards noticed that the Pueblo Indians had forged closer ties with the surrounding nomads. When the Spaniards approached the Pueblos of Jimenez, for example, they were greeted by a mixed force of Pueblos and Apaches. Once inside the Pueblo, the Spaniards' leader, Diego de Vargas, approached Apache warriors walking about freely. Other Spaniards observed that same situation in various parts of the Pueblo world. The Hopi Pueblo and the Walpi in northeast Arizona, several indigenous nations made a show of force. Quote, some of them were the Ute Nation. Vargas recorded in his diary, quote, and the other were Apaches and Conanas, Havasupas, and all of them were the allies and neighbors of the Hopi Pueblos. The colonialists thus encountered a tangle of newly forged alliances. Each Pueblo had become like a hub of the wheel, connected through the spokes of various bands of hunter-gatherers. The easternmost Pueblos, the Pacos and the Taos, befriended Apache bands and lived further to the north, east, while the Hopi Pueblos in the Acoma and Jimenez in western New Mexico developed alliance with groups of Dene and Utes. Before the arrival of Europeans, such interactions had been common. In the periods of between 1450 and 1600, Pueblo indigenous people had enjoyed close trade relationships with outlying nomads. In spite of their strikingly different lifestyles, town dwellers and nomads complemented each other well. The Pueblos exchanged corn and ceramics with hunter-gatherers for bison meat and hides, carbohydrates for protein, and pottery for hides. The Spaniards arrived in 1598. What did I mess it up? Surveilling? Hold on. It's a severity reducing this trade. The Pueblos now had to surrender their agricultural surplus to encomendadores and missionaries, and therefore retain few, if any, items to exchange. The archaeological records show fewer bison bones and bison-related objects among the Pueblos during the 17th century. Additionally, the Spaniards launched raids against outlying hunter-gatherers, further disrupting Pueblo Plains trades networks. With the Spanish exodus of 1680, the Pueblos had a chance to reestablish their old ties with the nomads. This trade appeared to have been reinvigorated in a very short time. Not only were plain indigenous people more present in the Pueblos of New Mexico, but they were also far more assertive. Horses had ushered a revolution in the region, as historians Pekka Hamanalainen Adley puts it. Equestrian indigenous people did everything better than their counterparts, who traveled by foot, move, hunt, trade, and wage war. The Equestrian Indigenous people could even challenge the Spaniards. The horses revolution unfolded by fits and starts during the 1600s, speeding up considerably with the Pueblo Revolt. When Spanish colonialists hastily abandoned New Mexico in the summer of 1680, they left behind the largest herd of horses anywhere in the northern Mexico. The Pueblo indigenous people lost little time in appropriating these animals and trading them away. The Apaches, the Dene, Utes, and others thus gained strength during the tumultuous final decades of the 17th century. Spanish officials were forced to tolerate the Pueblo Plains ties and to keep vigilance in case of any all indigenous alliance against them. Such a scenario was not far-fetched in 1704 to 1705. New Mexican Governor Juan Paz Hurtado conducted full-scale investigations within the friendships between the Pueblos and the surrounding heathens, quote unquote. After learning that some indigenous people in the Pueblos of San Juan had brokered a peace agreement with the Dene and Utes, various bands of Apaches, Jaracarilla, Tromentina, Archos, Ferran, and Gala, and other Pueblos. It looked like a formidable cabal that could easily lead to a general insurrection. Governor Paz Hurtado's vigorous investigation prevented such an outcome. But the episode is significant because it illustrates how Apaches, Dene, Utes, and other outlying indigenous people learned to use their newfound ties with the Pueblos to put pressure on the Spaniards and to enact commercial privileges. The case of the Comanche reveals how thoroughly the adoption of horses could change a group of peripatetic indigenous people. The Comanches were newcomers to the region. Only in the final decades of the 17th century did they start moving move southwards, move south towards New Mexico, or to begin experimenting with horses, which are probably first obtained from the Utes, their linguistic cousins. No Spaniard had ever heard of the Comanches until the earlier years of the 18th century. They and the Utes shared a homeland somewhere north of the Pueblo world, possibly in the eastern Colorado Plateau, and together they muscled their way into the trade fairs held in New Mexico. The Spaniards and the Pueblos soon became aware of these two stalwarts equestrian peoples. Rumors swirled that the Comanches and the Utes were mounted B-words, descending on New Mexico in order to pillage. But these nomads also brought variable trade items, including tanned bison hides, bison meat, and indigenous Comanche captives introduced Apaches from the east, Dene from the west, and the Pawnees from the north into New Mexico. The Comanches' radius of action was astonishing. In 1731, a New Mexican farrier asked one of the Comanches captives to which nation he belonged and how far it was to his country origins. The slave responded that he was a Ponan, quite possibly a Pawnee, whose traditional homelands was along the North Platte and Loup rivers in present-day Nebraska. The indigenous people also said that he had traveled with his captors for, quote, 100 sons, moving at the rate of about 10 leagues, 30 miles for each one. The farriers estimated that in the course of the year, the Comanches might travel more than 1,000 leagues, 3,000 miles from New Mexico, a distance that have been entirely possible, considering the Pawnee country was 800 miles away from the northern New Mexico, and that Comanches traveled to and from these lands, making various detours along the way. Hold on a second. Look ahead. Everybody remember page 158. Oof. Looks like I'm gonna have to find a stopping point. I'm not good at this. Yep, 158. 158. So I'm gonna find a stopping point, everybody. All right. The Comanches sold their in Mexico sometimes in the first decades of the 18th century. By the 1720s, they had become well-established traders, and by the 1760s, they were acknowledged as the permanent suppliers of captives into the regions. Their visit to New Mexico became a single event, and the early encounters of the mobilized the entire province. In 1761, the New Mexican farrier wrote to the Viceroy of Mexico, "Here the governor, acolytes, and lieutenants gather together as many horses as they can. Here is collected all the ironware possible, such as axe, hose, wedges, bricks, bridles, machetes, baldequis, heavy knives, used in the high trade, and knives. Here in short is a gathering everything possible for trade and barter with these people in exchange for deer and buffalo hides. And what is the saddest, in exchange small and large magnitudes of both sexes, for they are gold and silver and the richest treasures of the governors, who gorge themselves first with the largest mouthfuls from the table, while the rest eat the crumbs. It is easy. Hold on a second. It is easy to miss the full implications of the traffic of captives in the 17th century. Spanish cavalrymen had attacked the nomadic groups in New Mexico, particularly at will. One after another, the Spanish governors had ordered slaving raids on the Apaches, the Dene, and other hunter-gatherers peoples who still possess very few horses. But while the Spaniards initially held the upper hand, the diffusion of the horses evened out the playing field. After the Spanish retreat following the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, nomadic indigenous traders with newfound access to horses began to muscle their way into the market of New Mexico. In 1694, barely 2 years after the Spaniards had taken control of the province, a group of Dene arrived with the intention the Spanish authorities initially refused to acquire the young captives. After all I can't say that word, had made clear 14, oh my gosh, and the slaves were being ransomed from their indigenous people. They refused. Many also have had some to do with the desire of some New Mexican traders to monopolize the traffic of slaves. But the spurned Dene did not give up easily. To ratchet up the pressure, the traffickers proceeded to behead the captive children within the Spanish colonialist sites. In short terms, the youths lost their merchandises. But in the long term, the stratagem prompted New Mexican officials to reconsider the ban against ransom indigenous captives. Some years later, in 1704 to 1705, the Dene, together with the nomads and the Pueblo indigenous people, increased the pressures even more by treating an all-out anti-Spanish revolt. Increasing, it was around this time that New Mexican officials began sanctioning and ransoming of indigenous captives sold by these groups. In effect, make the laws. See, this whole chapter, I can't do this. This whole chapter is demonizing indigenous people as slave traders. I can't do this chapter. I can't do this because it's not true. I can't do this. Either I'm going to have to skip the whole chapter or I'm going to have to read it in different ways. But this dude, it's gotten worse. The whole notion has gotten worse. It's gotten fucking worse. I don't know. Yeah, I know, but like, you're gonna understand. Other people that know about this is gonna understand, but people coming in here will not understand. I can't do that as a white person. I can't. I just can't. It just doesn't work. 159. What's the next chapter? As a white person, I just can't do that. I'm not going to. I have principles. $159. 166. To mine, it's further. Let me look. 166. Yeah, 66. 166 is not the end of the chapter. Yeah. I am not gonna do this as a white person. Not gonna do that. This dude is a European mindset. I just cannot do that. I cannot allow for, maybe if an indigenous person was to read this part and actually explain the wrongness of these things, that would be great. But I'm not going to force any indigenous people to come up and do that. I just don't think as a white person, I should be reading something like that without having the full context of these lies that this person's saying. That's my problem. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Yeah, 175. Yeah, 175 starts a new chapter. The mission and display that. That's why I like put it down, because it's like, dude, I am not doing this as a white person. This dude's a Okay, we'll start chapter 7 tomorrow. We'll see what happens with chapter 7. I just can't do it. I can't do it. I'll do chapter 7 tomorrow, but I'm just going to skip chapter 6 because without my full, complete knowledge and know-how, I can't combat him by saying, all I can be and say is go, nuh-uh, nuh-uh. That's all I can do. I think with that chapter, I need, like, we need somebody, if someone's going to read that chapter, they can combat it. You know what I mean? Yeah, chapter 8, yeah. Jesus. I can't combat it. Well, I can, but I know it's not true, but shit. We'll try chapter 8 next time. We'll try chapter 8, see what happens. I don't know. I don't know. I think reading indigenous coming from a white perspective is harmful. I think it's harmful. Just my opinion. I don't care how knowledgeable you are. That's harmful as fuck. Exactly, Rachel. Exactly that. Exactly that part. Exactly that part. Put in the thing that we're skipping one chapter because of the fact that it's a white perspective that I'm not willing to engage on. Be honest with you. Standing Rock better be better. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 4 more chapters to go. I'm sorry, everybody. It was just, I can't do that. I can't do that. I'm too principled to do that shit. I'm sorry, buddy. All right, who wants to come up and talk? Anybody? All I gotta say is the Pueblo Revolt was based and needed. And I'm glad they got away with it, and I'm glad they won. But we'll see later on down the line, it looks like it's just going to add to more. Because revolts, it happens throughout the years. But it was nice to see that. So. Yeah. But yeah. I'm sorry, I had to skip that chapter. That chapter was just egregious. It's too white led. Too white centered. It feels like. All right, everybody. Since no one wants to come up and say anything, I'll go ahead and close it out for the night. We'll continue chapter 8 tomorrow. And we'll have 4 more chapters to go. And then we can start Standing Rock. Or the other one. We'll have so far Standing Rock looks like it's the winner so far. But just in case, I'll have other people say it.